Okay, we have one graph representation of quotas and tariffs. That was more for regular econ. I sort of wanted to show you an AP version of it, so there'll be two versions on your website, one like an AP version, one is like a regular version. Here's a basic supply and demand graph with quantity on the X and price on the Y, and we're going to make this graph of cars. Alright, so let's assume for a second that we're just looking at a domestic market, right? So the demand curve is D domestic for domestic demand. The supply curve is S domestic for just the domestic supply. Now once you add the rest of the world's supply in, you'd have to, obviously it would be an addition to the domestic supply, so the world supply would have right here, we call the supply sub-world, okay? And the demand curve stays there, and so you move along the demand curve. So with this more supply, this is absolute free trade, with this absolute free trade, we see that we'll call this price world, and we'll see that there is a quantity of the world. So you can see right off the bat that with free trade, consumers get lower price and a higher quantity demanded, right? More output. Okay, so, but at this price, how much would our domestic producers make? So what we do is we take this price and move it over, and it hits the supply curve, the domestic supply curve, right here. So we'll call this quantity domestic. All right, quantity domestic, we'll say free trade. So with free trade, this is how much we're putting in domestically. Okay. So right off the bat, we see. Does anyone have any questions that a student might want to ask? Does anyone have any questions? What is your question? Say it loud, please.
Who are tariffs good for? Who are they bad for?
That's a really good question. Thank you. Who are tariffs good for and who are tariffs bad for? Well, the tariffs are really good, obviously, for consumers because prices are low and they can get more product for a lower price. Who they're bad for? Who's free trade good for? Who's free trade good for is consumers, and that's bad for producers, right? Domestic producers, because the price is lower. So free trade is good for consumers, bad for domestic producers. So what they'll do is they'll put a tariff. And with a tariff, it's the question that our lovely assistant asked, we'll say this will be the supply tariff, okay? And at this supply of the tariff, here's where the new supply hits the demand curve right here. All right, so we'll call this point right here quantity free trade with tariff. And then here is our new price. We'll call this price with tariff. And it hits the original supply curve, the original domestic supply curve right here, which we'll call quantity domestic with a tariff. Okay? So who are tariffs good for? This is how much more the domestic suppliers are producing. So obviously a tariff is good for domestic suppliers. Who's a tariff bad for? Well, here's the world's quantity demanded at this point with no tariff, but now with a tariff, we've gone in. So the consumers are struggling. Right? So this area right here is essentially efficiency lost due to a tariff. So are there any other questions that you might be able to see? Any other questions that you want to ask?
Who are tariffs?
No, the second question.
Can you show me this on the graph?
Can you show me this on the graph? Excellent question. So this area right here, right? This area right here is what the producers gain with a tariff. All right? And this area right here, right? So because they were gonna have quantity output and queue domestic free trade, but with the tariff coming in, the new price was raised, right? So now they're going to produce more. So this area right here is the amount increase in production due to a tariff domestically. This area right here, right? This is the reduction of output in the world supply, right, due to tariff. So here, producers gain, here, consumers lose, right? I know this is a really busy graph, but essentially what I want you to see is, first of all, here's where the price is going to be with just domestic supply, and here's the output. But then when the world comes in, the purple line, we have a much lower price, right, and we have a much higher output, right? This is the difference in the output. So what governments will do to protect their own producers, they'll put a tariff, which will limit the amount of goods coming in because it's going to increase prices. A quota essentially is also, it's similar, it's just a set amount of product that can come into the country. Graphically, it will be very similar to this. Tariffs are probably better for a country in that it is reducing the amount of goods that can come in and certainly increasing price, but at least our government's getting some money, and if you want to get a hold of an item, you can, you just pay more price. With a quota, even if you want to get a hold of something, if the quota has already been met for the year, like 75,000 whatevers, Lamborghinis or whatever, if 75,000 have been bought, you can't get any the rest of the year. So a tariff probably is better for consumers than it is for the government, than a quota is, but they certainly have the same sort of effect graphically, right? So I know there's 5 different things here, but if you don't get this, watch slowly, rewind it or whatever you do on YouTube, and watch it, each line add and see what happens, okay?